You sit in a crowded room. Voices rise, laughter echoes, faces surround you. And yet inside, there's a silence no one else can hear. You smile at the right moments. You nod when expected. But the truth is simple and brutal. You feel completely alone. This is the paradox of loneliness. It doesn't always happen when you're by yourself. It happens when you're surrounded by people who don't see the real you. And here's the part no one tells you. Loneliness doesn't end when you add more people to your life. It ends when you stop abandoning yourself. Because loneliness isn't the absence of others. It's the absence of connection, to them and to you. And this is why simply surrounding yourself with people doesn't help. It's the mistake so many of us make. We confuse numbers with nourishment. We tell ourselves that if we just attend more events, keep busy, or fill our calendars with faces, the ache inside will finally fade. On the surface, it feels logical. If loneliness is being without people, then more people should be the cure. But you've already lived the opposite. You've walked into a room buzzing with energy, joined in the small talk, laughed at the right cues, and still left with that quiet emptiness. You've scrolled endlessly through feeds full of smiling faces, convinced for a moment you were connected, only to feel the ache grow sharper. That's because proximity is not belonging. Being near people is not the same as being seen by them. And when you're surrounded but still unseen, the loneliness deepens. Psychologists call this the loneliness paradox. Research shows it's not the number of people in your life that matters, it's the depth of your connections. One real conversation, where you're understood without performance, nourishes more than 100 shallow exchanges. Modern life only magnifies the problem. Social media gives us endless interaction but little intimacy. Notifications trick us into believing we're connected, while our deeper need, to be recognized, to be understood, remains unmet. That's why a crowd can feel lonelier than solitude, because at least when you're alone, your loneliness is honest. In a crowd, it becomes unbearable proof. You can be surrounded and still invisible. And that's the real wound. Not the lack of people, but the lack of being seen. Because to feel unseen isn't just uncomfortable. It cuts at the root of who you are. It whispers, you don't matter. You're forgettable. You could vanish, and no one would notice. This wound often begins early. Think back to childhood. Many of us grew up in environments where our emotions were brushed aside. Maybe you were told you were too sensitive, or that you were overreacting. Maybe when you cried, someone told you to toughen up. Or when you were excited, someone said, calm down, you're being dramatic. These moments may seem small, but they plant a brutal message. What I feel isn't valid unless others approve of it. Over time, you learn to hide your emotions, to explain them away, to shrink yourself just enough to stay acceptable. And without even realizing it, you start living in a way that keeps you safe from judgment, but also keeps you disconnected. Carl Jung saw this as one of the greatest dangers of modern life. He believed that when you adapt too much to what others expect, you slowly abandon your true self. And what takes its place is a mask, a persona, polished enough to fit in, but empty enough to leave you lonely. This is why loneliness feels like invisibility, because the world may see your mask, but it doesn't see you. And if no one sees the real you, then connection becomes impossible. Because how can someone connect with what you refuse to reveal? The tragedy is that this wound feeds itself. The more unseen you feel, the more you explain, justify, or perform, hoping someone will finally notice. But the more you perform, the further away you drift from your true self. And the further you drift, the lonelier you become. That's why loneliness isn't solved by being surrounded. It's healed when you're finally met, by yourself and by others, without disguise. And yet, even when you begin to see this clearly, the question remains, why does loneliness hurt so much? Why does it feel less like an emotion and more like an actual wound? Neuroscience gives us the answer. When researchers studied the brain under loneliness, they discovered something astonishing. The same regions that process physical pain light up when you feel socially isolated. To your brain, rejection or invisibility isn't just sad. It registers like a burn, a bruise, an open cut. That's because human beings evolved to survive in groups. For most of history, being excluded from your tribe wasn't just uncomfortable, it was deadly. Alone, you couldn't hunt, gather, or protect yourself. So the brain developed an alarm system. If you drift too far from others, it fires up the same pain circuits designed to keep you alive. Loneliness is not weakness, it's your biology screaming, something is wrong, reconnect, or you won't survive. But here's the cruel twist. The very system meant to protect you can trap you. When you feel lonely, your brain becomes hypervigilant, scanning constantly for signs of rejection. Even neutral expressions start to feel threatening. A friend's silence, a coworker's distracted look, your brain interprets them as proof that you don't belong. The cycle deepens. The more isolated you feel, the more you expect rejection, and the harder it becomes to reach out. Neuroscientist John Cacioppo, who spent decades studying loneliness, found that prolonged isolation doesn't just affect mood, it changes the body. Stress hormones surge, immune function drops, sleep becomes restless. Over time, loneliness erodes health as powerfully as smoking or obesity. That's why it feels less like an emotion and more like a wound, because in its very real way, it is. It damages not only the psyche, but the body itself. And yet, this biology also contains hope. If loneliness activates pain circuits, then connection, real connection, can soothe them. A single moment of genuine presence, a conversation where you feel understood, can calm the same alarm system that makes isolation so unbearable. Just as the body craves food or rest, the brain craves belonging. So loneliness is not proof that you're broken, it's proof that you're wired for connection. But here's the paradox. The more you hide behind masks, the less connection you'll ever feel. Which is why we need to look closer at these masks, the roles we play, and how they quietly make us lonelier than solitude ever could. We all wear masks, not the kind made of cloth or plastic, but the subtle disguises we build to survive. You play the easygoing friend, the reliable worker, the strong one who never cracks. Each role helps you fit into the expectations around you, but each one also pulls you a little further from yourself. Carl Jung called this mask the persona, the version of you that faces the world. It isn't inherently bad. Without it, social life would be impossible. We all need a way to navigate roles and responsibilities. But the danger comes when the persona becomes too thick, when the mask hardens until even you forget who's underneath. Then the mask no longer protects you, it imprisons you. And here lies the paradox. The more convincing the mask, the lonelier you become. Because people may admire the role, but they never touch the real you. Their affection lands on the performance, not the person. And somewhere inside, you know it. You feel it every time someone praises your strength while ignoring your exhaustion. Every time they love your smile but never ask about your silence. Brené Brown's research on vulnerability reveals why this is so destructive. She found that connection only happens when we allow ourselves to be seen, not the polished version, but the raw, imperfect human self. Masks might win approval, but they block intimacy. Vulnerability feels risky, but it's the only bridge strong enough to carry real belonging. Think about it. When was the last time you admitted to someone, "I'm not okay"? Or the last time someone shared their raw fear with you? In those moments, the mask slips, and suddenly, the loneliness softens. Because connection isn't built on perfection. It's built on shared fragility. The tragedy is that many of us spend years trapped in roles that guarantee our loneliness. We become who we think others need, hoping it will earn us love. But love built on performance never nourishes. It leaves you empty because deep down you know the truth. If they only love the mask, then they don't truly love you. And so the cycle continues, until you realize that loneliness is not just about being unseen by others. It's about abandoning yourself in the process. And that brings us to the next layer of the wound, how self-abandonment fuels loneliness from within. That's the cruelest part of loneliness. It isn't only about others failing to see you. It sharpens when you stop seeing yourself. Think about the quiet betrayals you commit against your own soul. Saying yes when every part of you was screaming no. Laughing politely at a joke that made you uncomfortable, just so you wouldn't seem difficult. Explaining away your sadness as just being tired because you didn't want to be a burden. Silencing the truth in your chest just to keep the peace in the room. At first, these betrayals seem small, necessary even. You tell yourself it's easier to bend than to face rejection. But every time you swallow your truth, you chip away at your own presence. Each false yes is another step away from yourself. Each silence is another brick in the wall that separates you from connection. Carl Jung once wrote, "Loneliness does not come from being alone, but from being unable to communicate the things that seem important to you." And that's the essence of self-abandonment. It isn't about the absence of people. It's about the absence of honesty with yourself. When you silence what matters most, your needs, your boundaries, your longings, you cut the cord of connection from the inside out. And here's the irony. The more you abandon yourself, the harder you work to be accepted by others. You perform, you explain, you smile when you don't mean it, all in the hope that someone will finally recognize you. But how can others recognize you if you no longer recognize yourself? How can anyone meet you if the person you're presenting isn't real? This is the shadow of self-abandonment, the way loneliness grows in proportion to the ways you betray yourself just to belong. You think compliance will keep you safe, but it only deepens the ache. You think pleasing others will bring connection, but it only leaves you more invisible. And so loneliness becomes less about the world turning its back on you, and more about the ways you've turned your back on yourself. Because in the end, loneliness doesn't come from being without people. It comes from losing yourself. And this is where the healing begins. When you stop abandoning yourself long enough to show up as you really are. Because loneliness loses its grip not when you're finally surrounded by the right crowd, but when you stop hiding behind masks and excuses. That's what vulnerability is. The courage to let yourself be seen. Not the polished version, not the carefully explained persona, but the raw, imperfect you. Researcher Brené Brown puts it simply, connection is why we're here. It's what gives purpose and meaning to our lives, and it only happens when we allow ourselves to be seen. Not when you're perfect, not when you've explained yourself well enough, but when you allow yourself to be seen as you are. This is why silence matters too. Most of us try to hold connection by filling space with explanations, justifications, endless words to prove we belong. But true presence isn't about defending yourself. It's about daring to sit in silence, trusting that your existence doesn't need a footnote. When you stop over-explaining, something shifts. Silence stops feeling like emptiness and starts becoming presence. You begin to realize that you don't need to justify every emotion, every boundary, every choice. You just need to live it. Of course, this doesn't happen overnight. Vulnerability is a practice, not a one-time leap. You start small. One honest sentence instead of a polished excuse. One no without an apology attached. One page in a journal where you tell yourself the truth you've been avoiding. Each small act is a test, and each test builds trust. The more you risk being seen, the more you discover that connection was never about being perfect. It was about being real. And here's the paradox. The very thing you fear, showing your unguarded self, is the very thing that makes you feel less alone. Because when you meet yourself honestly, you create the possibility for others to meet you too. And this is where loneliness begins to shift into something else, into a teacher in disguise. Loneliness, at its core, shows you where you've been disconnected, not just from others, but from yourself. It points to the gap between who you really are and the life you've been living. It highlights the places where you've been wearing masks, where you've silenced your truth, where you've traded authenticity for acceptance. Buddhism has always seen suffering this way. The Buddha taught that pain isn't simply punishment, it's a doorway to awareness. Every moment of suffering carries information, if you're willing to listen. And loneliness is no different. It's the psyche's way of saying, something vital in you has been ignored. Pay attention. This is why loneliness feels so sharp, almost unbearable at times. It's not just sadness, it's the soul tugging at your sleeve, insisting you stop running long enough to hear what it's trying to tell you. You can numb it with distractions, drown it in busyness, or smother it with noise, but the message doesn't disappear. It waits, and it repeats, until you finally turn toward it. And when you do, something remarkable happens. You realize loneliness is not proof that you're broken. It's proof that you're wired for connection. With others, yes, but also with yourself. Carl Jung believed that symptoms are not random enemies to be destroyed, but signals to be understood. Loneliness is one of those signals. It's the psyche's alarm bell, calling you back to the parts of yourself you've left behind. It hurts not because you're failing, but because something in you is trying to awaken. So instead of asking, "How do I get rid of this loneliness?" a better question might be, "What is this loneliness trying to teach me?" Because when you listen, the ache starts to transform. It stops being just a wound and begins to feel like a guide. And when you follow where it points, something inside you shifts. Because when you let loneliness guide you instead of crush you, something begins to change. The emptiness that once felt unbearable turns into space, space where presence can finally live. You stop looking for the crowd to silence the ache. You stop waiting for someone else to prove you belong. Instead, you discover that presence, your own presence, is enough. And that shift changes everything. Because suddenly, the emptiness that once felt unbearable begins to feel like space. Space to breathe, space to be. Space where you can finally meet yourself instead of running from yourself. And from that place, everything else begins to change. Friendships deepen, because you're no longer showing up half-present, hiding behind masks. You stop curating versions of yourself to win approval. You speak honestly, and in doing so, you create the possibility for real intimacy. People sense when you are whole, and they respond in kind. Love becomes more authentic. Instead of clinging to someone else to fill your emptiness, you can stand beside them as an equal. You stop asking to be saved and start learning what it means to share life, not escape it. Relationships built on rescue collapse under their own weight. Relationships built on presence, however, endure, because they're not about completing each other, but about meeting each other. Even self-respect grows, because for the first time, you're no longer betraying yourself just to be accepted. Every no you honor, every truth you speak without apology, becomes a brick in the foundation of your dignity. And that dignity cannot be taken away, because it's rooted in belonging to yourself. The philosopher Michel de Montaigne once wrote, "The greatest thing in the world is to know how to belong to oneself." That is the secret, not to escape loneliness forever, but to transform its meaning. When you learn how to belong to yourself, loneliness loses its grip, because it was never really about numbers. It was always about presence. And so the refrain returns. Loneliness doesn't end with people, it ends with presence. Presence with yourself, when you no longer abandon your own truth. Presence with others, when you let them see you without disguise. Presence with life itself, when you stop waiting for things to change before you begin to live. That's the transformation. Not the total disappearance of loneliness, because loneliness will visit again. But now, it no longer has the power to define you. Instead of an enemy, it becomes a reminder, a call back to presence, a call back to yourself. And when you answer that call, you discover something extraordinary. You were never truly alone. Because loneliness doesn't vanish by staying busy or surrounding yourself with people. It fades when you stop abandoning yourself. That's when silence becomes comfort, and solitude feels less like punishment and more like relief. Imagine sitting alone in a quiet room, not restless, not desperate, but steady, whole, present. That is the beginning of freedom. So let me ask you, where does loneliness weigh heaviest for you? In the middle of a crowd, in your closest relationships, or in the quiet moments with yourself? Share it in the comments. Your story might be the mirror someone else needs. So if this reflection stirred something in you, subscribe and turn on notifications, and come back here. Because this is a space where even in silence, you are not alone.